Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm sorry this might be a little bit late on a Sunday evening. It's been one of my twins' end of season rugby barbecue get together, not any playing any games, just get together and give out medals and say well done and go to the pub and have a couple of shandies. And then, goodness me, I'm now trying to put my thoughts together for a video, and I'm wondering whether I'm going to make any sense at all. So please excuse me if I struggle with words and thoughts and computers. So I'm going to go first to a comment from what I probably think is someone who this could be an American. It could be a Russian pretending to be American. These things happen. This guy is quite commonly commenting on my threads. And this was in response to trying to explain how, although America in real terms is the biggest provider of aid to Ukraine, and that is phenomenal, and I'm not belittling that at all. Please understand me. This is in no way trying to belittle America's help. Goodness me, America is just hugely important in Ukraine's success. There is the opposite. What I'm trying to do is say there's more ways to skin a cat, and actually trying to break out these figures and understand them in a nuanced and accurate way can be difficult. And sometimes we have to look at figures from different angles and understand statistics in a slightly better way than just headline, these guys are given this much stuff and these guys are given this much stuff, so these guys are better than these guys type thing. Anyway, Donald Trump said recently in a CNN town hall that the US has given $170 billion dollars of aid, and the EU has given $20 billion of aid. And that was highly controversial because A, it was just incorrect, and B, it also doesn't really reflect a nuanced understanding of how to evaluate those figures. So I just want to do a little bit of delving into this comment. So this comment goes as follows. The United States is into Ukraine for $170 billion as per President Trump, CNN town hall. CNN fact checks, we'll come back to this, European Union, 20 billion. Trump's claim, fact checked by CNN. Okay, I'll come back to this, I'll come back to that now. CNN didn't fact check that at the time. It was a live town hall, and Caitlin Collins did not have the ability to fact check that at all. It has subsequently been fact checked by CNN and found to be incorrect. So I want to get these kind of figures understood in a way that I think does justice to reality. Okay, let's first go to CNN and actually see what they did in their fact checking. So this is their piece fact checking the entire town hall, and my goodness me, there was a lot to fact check. Fact checking Trump's CNN town hall in New Hampshire. This is not about Trump. I'm not interested in Trump in this. So don't worry if you're pro-Trump, anti-Trump, whatever. This is irrelevant. What I want to do is just look at these figures and actually try and understand these figures better. That's all I'm interested in. So, aid to Ukraine. Let's just read this in its whole, and this is only going to be these three paragraphs. So Trump claimed that the US provided $171 billion so far to Ukraine in its war against Russia, while the European Union cumulatively has given $20 billion in aid. He also claimed that the US is, quote, giving away so much that, quote, we don't have ammunition for ourselves right now. Fact first. So both assertions are false. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine last February, the US has provided Ukraine $36.9 billion in military aid. And while some US and European weapons stockpiles have been depleted, the claim that the US does not have ammunition is false. I mean, that's absolutely bonkers. The fact, like the claim that the US has run out of ammunition is just insanely wrong. What the US want to do is get particular types of ammunition to Ukraine, and there's a depletion of stockpiles of those, particularly Soviet ammunition that the US doesn't produce and doesn't use, right? So there's a depletion of those stockpiles worldwide, and that's the same for Russia, incidentally, as well. Also, ammunition for artillery for the NATO ammunition is also short. Now, US aren't going to give away their strategic reserves of ammunition, but what they do need, what all the allies need, is Ukraine to have enough ammunition to fire their artillery successfully and on a par, ideally, with Russia. And that requires a massive production, upscaling in production, and use of stockpiles of NATO ammunition worldwide, right? US aren't running out. They're not giving away their own stocks to the point that they have none left, but they don't have extra, right? They've given away the stuff that they can figure that they can give away, and they're ramping up production, as is the EU, as are allies around the world, right? But the claim that the US are running out of ammunition is just absolutely incorrect. And the claim that the US has given 171 and the EU 20 billion is utterly incorrect, right? It's just wrong, right? So for this guy to repeat this, I assume this guy is actually just a Russian bot repeating talking points, right? Because it's like, oh, this person said something that would be useful for us. There's a utility in what this guy says, so we're going to amplify that because it's divisive, right? And if it gets people like you and I to argue with each other, job done. So I would implore you not to argue with me. Let's be unified on this if you support Ukraine, right? In a general sense. Yes, we can nitpick, but I think the intention here is to drive a wedge. Okay, just to continue, the US military and defense industry are planning to increase production of critical ammunition, as I've said, being sent to Ukraine to fill US stocks. The US Army is planning a 500% increase in 155mm artillery shells, a roughly 33% increase in guided multiple launch rocket systems, GIMLRS, those HIMARS basically, surface to surface medium range missiles a year, doubling production of Javelin tank anti-tank missiles, and increasing production of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to a minimum of 60 a month. Now, remember, I'm pretty sure all of that production will be indigenous US manufacture. So this is stimulating the economy, and I've talked about this ad infinitum. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole again, but you can argue that all of that production is a benefit to the US. Yes, they might be giving it to Ukraine, but it's a benefit in terms of their global power, their global positioning, the strategic. Well, the US's geopolitical strategy vis-a-vis Russia and the hegemony. So the US kind of supreme power base versus Russia and China, etc., etc. And then also the unit costs of these things come down. So the US Army can afford more because actually they're ordering more and blah, blah, blah. And there's loads of stuff and tax revenues and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. I said I won't talk about that. I just talked about it. Whatever. Okay. Now let's look at the actual figures. So 171 versus 20 is just bogus. It's not correct. Now, these figures are a little bit out of date because these go to the end of February 2023. So this is like a year's worth of figures. Now there's going to be March, April, and a little bit May. So and in that time, bear in mind, Germany has just announced a 2.7 billion euro round of military aid. Right, their biggest lot, but then America have added to that, the US have added to that as well, and other nations. So these figures are going to be out of date, but you're still. It's not like since then only the US has given stuff. There's going to be all sorts going on. Right, I've explained to you previously that we need to understand donations in terms of what different countries having in capability. Now, I know some people say, "Oh, it doesn't matter." Like the big thing is that US has given the most. Yes, absolutely agree. I don't disagree. This isn't not about belittling the US. The US has given the most stuff. My argument is the US has the most stuff, and they have the ability, financial, I guess, headroom to be able to give the most stuff. And we can. One of the ways of measuring capability, economic capability, is in GDP, gross domestic product, which is the amount of stuff you produce as a country a year, like how much your country is kind of worth on an annual basis. So it's a percentage of how much your country is worth. So it's like saying you're a millionaire, right? You've got A and B, Mr. A and Mr. B. So Mr. A gives, I said this the other day, I'm going to repeat myself. Mr. A gives £1,000, right? Or $1,000. Mr. A gives $1,000 and Mr. B gives $100,000. And you're like, oh, Mr. B's way nicer than Mr. A. Mr. B's doing much more. Yes, Mr. B is doing much more in real terms. Well done. That's awesome. Giving $100,000 to whatever cause is a much bigger thing. But if Mr. A only has like $10,000 to their name and is giving $1,000, that's a tenth of what they own. And if Mr. B is a billionaire, then actually the percentage of what Mr. B has and could give, what they do give as a proportion of what they could give, is much, much smaller. And so you could argue, yes, Mr. B is giving more stuff, but Mr. A is kind of more generous, or is doing a greater effort in relation to where they're at. And that's super important. So as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of what different nations have, and I explain this, the US sits actually broadly in the middle, or not in the middle, towards the top, but further down the list than one might think. So let's go to the Statista stats here. So as a percentage of GDP in that time frame, a year's time frame, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania all give around Latvia 1.24%, Estonia 1.1%, Lithuania 0.93%, Norway 0.7%, Poland 0.64%, Netherlands 0.46%, Czechia 0.41%, UK 0.38%, Bulgaria 0.37%, US 0.37%. So the US is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9th equal, there or thereabouts. So you could say, in relation to their capabilities, the US are like 9th in the world for what they're giving. And the size of the military industrial complex of the US is phenomenal. The amount of money they spend on their defense budget is extraordinary, et cetera, et cetera. And there's so much to talk about that. I'm not belittling the US contribution. It's amazing. Keep repeating that. But let's understand the nuance here. So then this guy, and he said it in a number of different places, and he keeps saying the same kind of thing, like fact check, as you see here, blah, 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 says all the same kind of stuff. Europe is cheap, Europe, blah, 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 blah. Right. Okay. So Europe has 500 million people. America has, I don't know, 350 million people, whatever, somewhere around those kind of areas. But what we really need to look at is GDP. So the gross domestic product for the US is 23.32 trillion here. So that's 2021 figures. Let's just go for whatever I can find, just give you basic understanding of a little bit of the maths. $23.32 trillion is kind of what they're worth, if you like. EU, $16.6 trillion. Okay, just the back of a cigarette packet calculation. The EU's GDP is 71% of what the US GDP is. So 71% is kind of like the EU is worth 71% of the US, economically speaking. You can argue about finer details about whether GDP is a good measure of this, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in basic terms, right, okay. Then we go back to look at some of these stats, and we look at, let's go down. So government support, here's a good one. So government support to Ukraine by country group in billions of euros. So it doesn't really matter because we're going to turn this into percentage. So the US, and again, this is by the end of February, has given $71.3 billion worth of aid. And that's going to be, I presume, humanitarian, military, and structural, and all sorts of other stuff, like total aid, I would have thought that is. So government support, 71.3 billion. The EU has given 61.9 billion euros. What is the EU's amount of money they've given to Ukraine as a percentage of what the US has given? By these statistics, that is 86% of the amount the US has given. Now, if you remember, I've just worked out the GDP. The EU's GDP is 71% of the US's, and what they're giving is 86% of the US's. In other words, the EU has given a greater proportion of government aid to Ukraine as a proportion of their GDP than the US. Now, this is not an argument as who's given more, as in like a value of that country, etc., etc. I'm not interested in this. What I'm interested in is showing this guy to be a bit of a charlatan. And that is not in and of himself. Like, I really couldn't give a monkeys about this person per se, but he's representative of a voice that is trying to drive a wedge by saying, oh, look at how rubbish the EU is, and look at how amazing the US is. And you could say this about Trump and that kind of thought as well. And you could apply. What would be lovely is if you hear these kind of arguments in your workplace, you could say, actually, you're not quite right there, and here's why you're not right. And maybe you could refer back to some of what I'm saying here as a kind of way to combat inaccuracy and mistruths and disinformation. So if these figures are to be trusted, and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy is a really good, I think, a really good source for understanding different aid to Ukraine over time, then the EU are actually providing a greater amount as a proportion of their GDP to Ukraine than the US. However, it's not just seeing it like that, and it's not just seeing it in terms of real terms, but it's a kind of a combination of both. It's saying, like, in real terms, the US has given the most stuff, like the most equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But the EU has given like slightly more in terms of what they as a proportion of GDP, and this is both important. It's just like everyone give as much as they can, and let's just celebrate what we have done. And it would be great if there can be a parity there, like either bring the US up in one respect or the EU up in another respect or whatever. Just everyone do as much as they possibly can. The other problem of taking this approach to kind of like the EU's done this and the US has done this is the EU, although there is this unity in terms of it being a group of countries. There are also countries within the EU that have done way more than other countries, and there are countries within the EU that have done way not enough, right? So it's really difficult to, it's really problematic to say, as you know, Trump and this guy has said, that the EU has done X and the US has done Y. It's like, yeah, the EU has done X includes loads of countries that have done considerably more than the US, and loads of countries that have done considerably less than the US. And so therefore, just to rather simplistically say the EU's done this, the US has done that, is problematic, because, you know, as you can see here, you can look at Italy and say 0.06% of GDP compared to, you know, the US is not good enough. Actually, Italy are coming up with quite a lot of goods at the moment, and actually it then gets, you can be even more nuanced than that, because you say that some of the stuff that Italy is giving is of greater value than some of the stuff that, even though there's less stuff, but it might be like they are giving Iris tea or Sant tea or whatever, and those are really high quality stuff, and they're given a couple of them, but actually that's got greater impact than like a whole bunch of BMP ones that this country's given. So how do you but those are really useful in different other spheres, right? So it's like you're not going to send an air defense system into the front lines to attack a tank, right? Or like you're not going to have troops hanging off it and drive it in and then say that's our way of delivering troops. In other words, there's a total functional differential between these bits of equipment, and money sometimes isn't the greatest guide of who's given the most. Like sometimes, yeah, this country has done amazingly because they've given loads of this stuff which we've actually really used, and this country's done something else, and it could even be, and this country's given loads of humanitarian aid, which is not even military aid, but actually it's still super important, right? So it's really difficult to start pitting one country against another country, or the EU against the US, etc., etc. It's just it demands, I think, a much greater nuance than that, and I hope what I'm doing here is explaining that without trying to say one organization or one country is better than another. You know, without, as I keep saying, without the US, Ukraine would be screwed. But yeah, there you go. Talking about narratives and misinformation, disinformation, Scott Ritter, just he's a bit of a deplorable human in my books. He, and you can a pretty good judge of where he sits is the fact that he is all over Russian state TV at the moment, just peddling his absolute nonsense. I could play you this video. I don't want to. I don't want to give him the oxygen that he doesn't deserve. This guy is a Russian shill, and I don't think he requires any other time and effort on my part other than to say that, yeah, he's on Russian state TV. You can pretty much dismiss what he says. Right, I'm going to look at desertion. I talked to you about this the other day. That there are really high rates of desertion in the Russian armed forces at the moment. And Crypto Wiki's done a bit of a thread on this, so we'll dip into that. Cases of desertion in the Russian armed forces have massively increased over the past year, according to Media Zona. In the first 4.5 months of 2023, there have already been more prosecutions than the whole of 2022. Desertion is known as having left for Sochi or to have become a Sochi resident from the abbreviation SOC, unauthorized abandonment of a military unit. It's criminalized under Article 337 of the Russian Criminal Code. In late 2022, the Russian government introduced tougher restrictions and tighter enforcement of Article 337, increasing the severity of the penalties during the period of mobilization or martial law, in wartime or in conditions of armed conflict or combat operations. By the end of 2022, Media Zona reports the number of cases of desertion increased by 63% compared to the previous year. Russian government figures state that just over 1,000 people were convicted of this in 2021, and more than 1,300 were convicted in 2022. The number of criminal cases has soared this year, where there were 1,053 cases between January and the first week of May 2023, compared to 1,001 cases in the whole of 2022. The number of cases heard weekly also soared from about 100 a month in 2022 to over 400 a month now. Interestingly, that's actually monthly, not weekly. But then that can be divided down to weekly. So who knows? Desertion is Desertion is punishable with between 5 to 10 years imprisonment. However, Media Zona notes that many defendants are given suspended sentences by the garrison courts, often to ensure that they can be sent directly to the war. The military no longer discharges convicted soldiers. Sometimes commanders specifically petition for a defendant to be, quote, sent in the prescribed manner to the zone of a special military operation where he can prove his correction by his behavior and actions. Courts generally grant this. In other words, you've been done for desertion. Rather than being in prison, they're like, well, there's no point in imprisoning him. Send him back to the front line. And you can kind of understand that, right? Because, you know, by deserting and going into prison, you're kind of getting your way. It's like, I'd rather be in prison. I assume this is the case. I'd rather be in prison back in Russia, getting, 3 solid meals a day or whatever, and not dying, rather than being sent to the front line and maybe dying, probably dying. So on and so forth. Given the huge casualties sustained by Russian forces fighting Ukraine, however, this may have a good chance of being a de facto death sentence. Who knew? A suspended sentence is also an effective threat to hang over an offender to ensure his obedience on the battlefield. So there you go. Just a little dip into that. Let's have a look at a few other things. I'm going to go to another comment in a second. I reported this morning my news piece, and I think my frontline update, that a bunch of colonels have been killed in Klishchivka, I think, where they've been hit, I think, by artillery south of Bakhmut. The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced the death of two. Is quite interesting because I said I can't verify this. It's just coming from a random pro-Ukrainian source, but actually the Russian MOD have announced the death of 2 colonels near the front line in Bakhmut, including the commander of the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade, Colonel Makarov, and Deputy Commander of the Army Corps for Military Political Work, Colonel Yevgeny Brovko. The source I said this morning, there was 3 that died and 1 possibly could be on the way, or 1 injured or something like that. Just to continue here, the commander of the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade was reportedly killed when his command post in the south of Bakhmut in the town of Klishchivka was struck with a Ukrainian artillery strike, while the deputy commander of the Army Corps of Military Political Work was reportedly killed while conducting defensive operations in the city of Bakhmut. Oh, interesting. So 2 different, well, that's the claims of the Russian MOD. It could well be that there are more deaths than that, but that was the claim by the Ukrainians. So take that with a pinch of salt. But that pinch of salt seems to have been able to grow some truth. Right, I'm going to go to another claim here in my threads, and yeah, I know I'm don't bother dealing with trolls and all that kind of stuff, but I find it interesting, and actually sometimes I just want to say, right, I'm going to hold you to that. Just want to hold you to that, Mr. Trevor Shea here says, too bad. Trevor Shea, also known as Ivan, said, too bad all these little counterattacks by Ukraine failed. Like, it's interesting he's saying that they have failed when they're, just starting. Oh, that's failed. Is that what your boss is telling you? So what I want to do is I want to hold up what they're saying, say, can I hold you to that? You've said that. I'm going to remember that in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll revisit this and see whether you still think the same thing. Maybe just probing attacks, but there were no breakthroughs, or even though today there's claimed 10 miles of breakthrough, is it? Uh, as of today, and that more territory has been gained by Ukraine than Russia over the last in a few days than Russia in the last however many weeks. It's just that so when Russians come on threads to say, "Oh, this is this is pure copium," and all that kind of nonsense, it's like, yeah, that's what you're doing here. Also, advances were made in Bakhmut, and Russian controls 99.2% of the city now. Yeah, just wonder in a couple of days what it'll be. A Ukrainian spring counteroffensive when? Exactly what we're talking about all the time, which is this isn't it now. You'll know about it when it happens. So this is just desperation. And I'd like to think that when Russia were doing really, really well no, Russia were never doing really, really well. Russia were doing somewhat better than they had done previously and elsewhere in taking bits of Bakhmut incrementally over time. I was honest with that. Ukrainians are in trouble here, and Bakhmut is getting the Russians are taking more and more territory in Bakhmut, and it's not looking great for the Ukrainians. And if you're pro-Ukrainian, that's not a good look. But it's done the job it needed to do in attriting Russian forces, etc., etc. Actually, I like to think that I was entirely right with what I was saying, because we've got to a point where the Russians have completely culminated, as I said, and it looks like the Ukrainians are going to be able to counterattack in this area as a kind of direct result of the Russians culminating. They've run out of momentum, resources. They can't reconstitute in a way they would like, and so this is a perfect time to hit them back. And this is just starting. And the fact that you've got these kind of voices just saying, too bad for the little Ukrainian counterattacks. They failed. No breakthroughs made in the lines. Maybe just probing attacks, but they lost a lot of people to do it. Of course, there's absolutely no evidence supported here. And this is the usual kind of nonsense Russian bot factory response. Too bad for Ukraine. They aren't launching their counteroffensive. They've been trying some small counterattacks, but they only succeeded in taking back tiny little strips of land, just not enough. Very insignificant. They lost the Battle of Bakhmut. The sting of the defeat must be hard. And this is just projection, but it's also, notice how these kind of bots repeat themselves and repeat these kind of pat phrases and statements. You can imagine them going, right, boss, what do we have to say today? Well, how are we going to explain the fact that Bakhmut is looking like the Russians are us, like, because I'm Russian? How do we explain that we're getting a bit of an ass whooping in Bakhmut? Well, this is how we're going to spin it. Right, it's only little probing attacks. They haven't succeeded. Where are the breakthroughs? Just go with that today and just hope that there aren't any breakthroughs tomorrow. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's how you want to spin it. Fair enough, but don't expect any of us to believe this nonsense and think that that you actually know what you're talking about. You don't. You're just being told to say this by your boss. This is not good for. This is just not good for the Ukraine. For the Ukraine, they should have back again. Who are you, Russian? I think so. They should have Bakhmut half encircled by now. Is we Were you saying that about Russia when it took them 9 months? How long? I don't even know. It's so long. I forgot. I can't even do time now. It's been that long. They, how did they get on in the circling? Like, because the Ukrainians have been on a counterattack for 3 days, 4 days tops, and they've taken what, 10 miles of land? Just like after 9 months, did you ever say this is just not good for Russia? They should have Bakhmut half encircled by now after 9 months, but their little counterattacks aren't going as planned. Their gains are very insignificant. Did you say that every single day of the Russian the Russian attacks, offensives? No, you didn't. So these are called double standards, or hypocrisy, or I can dismiss you. Sorry, Trevor. Right, moving on. Let's talk about those 4 aircraft that were taken down yesterday, and the 5th one that was taken down the day before in Crimea. 4 yesterday, 2 Mi-8s that were special electronic warfare jamming helicopters, and 2 jets, Su-35 and Su-25, I think. So there are still loads of theories going around about this. I'm just going to throw out some more theories that people are talking about, and I still don't know what happened. But also, there's a bit of contradiction within Ukrainian sources by the looks of it, or pro-Ukrainian sources. So, explanations about 4 shot down Russian aircraft yesterday, and, quote, ambush was carried out with Nazam's air defense system, whose crew knew the exact corridor along which the aviation group was supposed to fly. Local residents saw 6 simultaneous launches in north of Chernihiv region. I don't know where that has come from, but this is a source I quite often use. But it's a bit annoying when you put quotes in and then don't say where that source is. interesting because we wonder, it is conceivable that there are some decent air defense systems put in the north of Ukraine that could easily reach into. I mean, you think of Patriot, NASAMS, SAMT, and all these kind of air defense systems. It's really conceivable that those Russian aircraft could have been taken out by Ukrainian air defense systems. It's not inconceivable at all. The spokesman at the Air Force of Ukraine, Yuri Ignat, said that five units of Russian military equipment fell in Bryansk region yesterday. So there's this claim now that there wasn't just four in Bryansk. Forget the Crimean one. That there was actually five in Bryansk, and this is something that's coming out a little bit. There's no really solid detail on this. It's just some claims that are going around from Ignat. The enemy attacked Ukraine from the northern direction. There were two helicopters that formed an obstacle and escorted the strike group Su-34, sorry, Su-34 and Su-35, which were some of the newest aircraft. Something went wrong, something happened, it's not clear what, and now we have such a result. A third helicopter was also added. Now, was that the one in Crimea? I don't know, but it seems like he's talking about a third helicopter in the Bryansk region. Tim White is going on what on Yuri Ignat, what he said Ukraine shot down five aircraft. Now, I don't think that Yuri Ignat said that Ukraine shot down five aircraft in the incident over Russia's Bryansk region, not four as originally believed. Yuri Ignat clarified all aircraft flew on a combat mission to the front. Yes, but I don't think he claimed that it was Ukraine that did it. So we need to be a little bit careful here. The Euromaidan press reports that Russians' own air defenses are behind the crashes of five Russian air assets in Bryansk, and that's according to the Air Force Command spokesperson, which is Yuri Ignat. He said two Russian aircraft and three helicopters crashed on that day. So it now appears that there are five. So let's go to his quote. This is from the Euromaidan press. On the 14th of May, on the national telephone, Yuri Ignat, the spokesman for the Air Force Command of the Ukrainian Army, commented on the possible reasons for the multiple crashes for the Russian aircraft and helicopters. It's not a question for me to address here. The Russians have already commented on everything, acknowledged, mourned because a black day of aviation and so on. About what was going on there, they have written too. To paraphrase in simple terms, helicopters and airstrike group were attacking Ukraine from the north, from Bryansk Oblast. They are doing this on a daily basis. In fact, conducting strikes with guided air bombs. So we know that these sorts of aircraft have been releasing FAB guided bombs, those big FAB 500s, big pieces of munition and blowing up stuff just in the northern areas of Ukraine. And so this fits in with that kind of idea. They are doing this on a daily basis, he says. In fact, conducting strikes with guided air bombs. We're already talking about a third helicopter there as well. So five in total. Apparently, they ran into some trouble. And that's suitably vague. When asked whether it is possible that Russia's own air defense forces shoot down their own helicopters and planes, he replied, "It turns out so," he said, adding that there's already an analysis there of who's to blame. Who they're going to be fired for this. So who's going to be fired for this? Punished for this ongoing mess. It's nice to read such news by the enemy. So he's playing into the idea that, yes, it was Russian forces that shot down Russian aircraft. And indeed, if the Ukrainians were responsible for shooting those aircraft down, he would probably still say that too. So he probably... I assume it's useful for the Ukrainians here to say that the Russians shot their own down. It doesn't get into complications as to whether Ukraine are using weapons over the border in a very explicit manner. So it's probably better for them to just say, yeah, Russians cocked up. Yeah, we didn't do it. No, it wasn't us, even though it might well have been them. That's my understanding, but correct me if you think I am wrong. And then finally, I'm going to, just talk very briefly about this. Zelensky, he said quite a bit recently. He's been interviewed in Italy when he's in Italy, so there's stuff coming out about that in Germany as well. So there's lots to talk about with regard to what Zelensky has been saying. But he says Ukraine is now almost ready for a successful counteroffensive. On May the 14th, said that Ukraine has almost enough weapons to begin its long anticipated counteroffensive, and that Ukrainian soldiers are almost ready for success. So that is a change in rhetoric, because only a few days previously he was saying, yeah, we still need to wait for X, Y, and Z. That is a change in message there. that's me for today. Really appreciate you supporting the channel, being here to listen to me rabbit on in a total stream of consciousness. This is me just putting up tabs and banging on. So if I don't make any sense, I do apologize. Had a couple of beers. I've got multiple sclerosis as well, so I very often struggle with my like right now with my words. Today, just as side, personal aside, so it was like fathers and sons or families with their kids, mums as well, kicking rugby balls, and you match up with someone else's kid, and you try and kick the ball as far as you could, a bit like golf, and you go to one end of the grounds and then back. And I was like, I've got MS, so I'm not going to do this. And I said, no, I'm going to overcome this. I'm going to do this. Right. I might fall over if I kick this ball, but I'm gonna team up with this kid. So I teamed up with another kid. It's like, you go for it. Okay, good kick. I took over. I'm like, I can do this. I used to play rugby years. I like haven't kicked a ball since my MS has got worse and my mobility's been affected, but I can do this. I went for this big kick and just I couldn't lift my legs. So I seem to you like I'm fine. Like I'm talking, I'm moving my arms, but get me to run. I can't run. My mobility is actually really poor. And I just kicked the ground. I couldn't even lift my leg enough to kick the ground. I just spooned my foot into the ground. Ball fell down. I was like, yeah, I'm going to go in for a cup of tea. So just, I was like, mate, you're going to have to get another dad. I can't even kick a rugby ball. So, yeah, I think my sporting days are over, which is a shame. I used to love all the sports, but anyway, that's just a personal side. I've enjoyed today. I hope this was useful. Please, as I say, like, subscribe, and share, and hit bells and blow whistles. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.